Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. We wanted to take a minute to look at some other stuff that's not in the news regular. We want to look at the environmental racism, find out what it is and what's happening in that particular area. So joining me today is Professor James Manigault-Bryant. He's a professor of Africana Studies at Williams College. Professor, Brother James, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, we hear a lot about institutional racism. We hear about economic racism. What exactly is environmental racism?
Environmental racism is the systematic placement of industrial facilities or particularly or waste treatment plants when they're placed next to communities of color, next to Black communities, whether those facilities pre-existed the movement of Black people to those areas, or whether facilities are actually built there after Black people arrive. It really doesn't matter. The effect is the same. But environmental racism is when those facilities that can potentially leave pollutants in the air, the soil, and the water of Black communities, communities of color, poor communities. That is environmental racism, and it's not only a national phenomenon. It's not only a phenomenon in the United States, but it's global. It's a global phenomenon. We're able to identify cases like Tallevast, which we'll be talking about momentarily. They're found all over the world. We mentioned in the article that we'll be talking about poisoning Tallevast. So there's a similar facility that there's a film that actually traces the same industrial plant that's located in what's called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. There's a similar facility owned by the same company in South Africa, for example. So it's not just a national problem, but it's a global problem.
Okay, now we noticed though you drilled down on a particular town in Florida in your article, and you did a deep dive into that. Could you tell us what happened to this town? What happened? I mean, it was like 85 houses or so. What happened to the people in this town? And how did it get resolved?
Yes. So the town community is called Tallevast. Tallevast is a small Black community right on the county lines between Sarasota and Manatee counties in Florida, the central west coast of Florida. It's about an hour south of Tampa. And Tallevast was established at the turn of the 20th century. It used to be a turpentine still. In fact, the town was named after Jeter Hollis Tallevast, who's a white man from South Carolina, and he migrated to the strip of land for the pine trees. And Black laborers from across the state went to this area to work around the turpentine still. After the still closed or shut down in 1920, some of the Black workers stayed on the land, purchased land. Some who hadn't worked on the still from northern Florida went to this area that it became this burgeoning Black community, self-sustaining in many ways. It had its own grocery store. It had dentist office. It continues to have a dentist office, 3 churches, a community center, and this was say at its commercial height. I guess you could say it was probably in the 1960s. In 1959, a couple of U.S. veterans opened a beryllium manufacturing facility. Beryllium is a light metal that is used throughout the defense industry for weapons, for surveillance equipment, satellites. Was used quite a bit by NASA during the space shuttle program. And beryllium is a lightweight metal, and it requires a very like delicate process to mold it into a form that can be used for those purposes. And so a small beryllium manufacturing facility was established in Tallevast in 1959. It really took off and changed its name in 1961. It became the American Beryllium Company, and it was under the auspices of Loral Corporation, which is still in existence. And for the next 35 years, from 1961 to 1996, when the plant closed down, it machined beryllium, but the machining process also involved using chemical solvents, one of which is trichloroethylene, TCE. And the trichloroethylene would be used in cleaning the machining tools and instruments. And the used TCE was then stored in on-site storage tanks on the ABC premises. From our calculations, when I say our, I've been doing this research with a couple of colleagues from Williams College, Jose Constantine in geosciences, and our very, very sharp student, Ruby Bagwin. We discovered from looking at documents held by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection that the on-site storage facilities, the on-site storage tanks began to leak. They started leaking likely around the time that that ABC began its manufacturing process. And so for 35 years, this dangerous chemical TCE, which has been linked to various forms of cancer, to miscarriages, TCE was being leaked into the groundwater of the Tallevast community. Lockheed Martin purchased Loral Corporation in 1997. And when they purchased Loral Corporation, they assumed ownership of the American Beryllium Company in Tallevast. And although the plant had been shut down, Lockheed sought to essentially make the site available for someone else to purchase. And so they ran an environmental audit. And when they ran the audit, they discovered in quotes, they discovered that this chemical, this dangerous chemical of TC, had been leaking from the on-site storage tanks into the community. And they found out that it had created an underground plume of about 200 acres. They reported this leak to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection in 2000.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yes, sir. Please.
When you say leaking into the community, you mean it went into the water table that spread across that whole entire area? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's absolutely right. That's right. Okay. Yes. And what made it most dangerous, or most damaging, most violent, is that many of the homes in Tallevast were on private water wells, wells that were located in their backyards. And so with the TCE leaking into the groundwater, the TCE was then linking into the wells and then into the water that residents were consuming for everyday use, for drinking, for bathing, for cooking. The aspect of this story that we focused on this longer story that we focused on in our Poison Tallevast piece was what the Florida Department of Environmental Protection uh, did with this information or didn't do with the information that it received after Lockheed reported the contamination in 2000. And they essentially uh, sat on the information, may not be the right way of phrasing it, but they continued their communications with Lockheed about how to resolve the situation, but they did not tell the community of Tallevast what happened. And the community did not find out that they were consuming polluted water until 2003. So for 3 years, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection had this information and did not inform the community. The community did not find out until Lockheed's environmental consultants began installing its monitoring wells throughout the community. So they began digging holes on the lawns of community members, and with the purpose of installing the wells. And one community member, Mrs. Loral Ward, uh, saw this, caterpillar, I assume, this bulldozer digging into her lawn, and she went and confronted the engineer and was like, "Why are you digging into my lawn?" And he, I guess, reluctantly told her that she should check with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection that the community's water had been compromised. And then that led to the community the community leadership, community organization called Focus, which stands for family-oriented community united strong, began a battle that continues to this day to try and get some semblance of justice for what has happened.
Okay, and it seems like in your article you report that there initially this the retired nurse uh, had actually organized a survey to check the health of the citizens, whereas the Department of Environmental Protection in Florida did nothing. They send an investigator out that wouldn't even get out of her car. Uh, and somebody else that came back saying that the community was shabby. And so they never actually even identified all the people that had been affected. Tell us a little bit about this effort, because it seems like it took several years of the community organizing itself to address this. And what happened?
Yes, sir. Yes. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection uh, was really the lead agency, and it was coordinating its efforts along with the local Department of Health in near Tallevast, the Manatee County Department of Health, and with the Florida Department of Health. Those agencies or offices um, were essentially charged with, or took it upon themselves. They were supposed to identify the wells in the community, um, and to determine which homes were in direct contact with the pollution. And the piece that you referenced there, Mr. Conway, about the representative from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection going to the community, she was charged with, she was I forget her exact title, she was sort of I guess like a field, I guess you would call it like a field worker of some sort. I forget her actual title. But nonetheless, she was charged with going to the community to identify the number and the location of the private drinking wells. And in looking at documents that are available through the public database of the FDP, there's an email that we honed in on for the article where it essentially notes that is sent by this worker, Kimberly Brooks was her name, and she went to Tallevast and drove around the community, but claimed that she was too scared to get out of her car because of her perception of the condition of the community and the condition of the homes, and because she saw a lot of dogs and she's fearful of dogs. In our reading, or at least in my reading, those were just code words for she was scared. She's white. She's scared to be around black people and scared to get out of her car to actually identify the wells. So this was during the 3 years that the FDP did not tell the community about the contamination. So during this 3 years, you have instances like Kimberly Brooks going to the community and not identifying the wells. A lot of bureaucratic back and forth between these different offices, and none of them able to actually identify the number of wells. What we're able to see from our review of these documents is that it's a number of things. One, that FDP had information in its own office that there were private drinking wells in Tallevast. So they didn't really have to go out and do the field work, or have this frightened woman go into the community and actually identify them. Although it wasn't a bad tactic or strategy, but they actually had information that there were wells actually in their office. The other thing is that if they had just asked anybody in the community, if they had just spoken with any person, they could have told them it's a very close, tight-knit community. Everyone knows who their neighbors are and their source of water. They could have just asked community members if they were on wells or not. So this back and forth, or this refusal to collect really simple information, prolonged the notification of Tallevast residents. And the other piece of the article that you referenced about the retired nurse, Mrs. Helen Heathington, who has since transitioned. Mrs. Heathington, once the community found out about the contamination, and with these agencies being so slow in actually acting on what had transpired, Mrs. Heathington conducted her own door-to-door health survey to just get a sense of rates of sickness in homes, and she discovered an alarming rate of sicknesses and of miscarriages throughout the community. The Florida Department of Health and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR. Those agencies conducted their own health studies, or have conducted their own health studies since the discovery of the contamination. They ran, I think, 3 or 4 of their own health studies. But none of those studies actually, they didn't actually speak with residents. They didn't actually sit down and talk with them in the way that Mrs. Heathington did, right? They relied on health information that had been collected in Florida state databases. And so they ran statistical analyses of data in these databases. And those studies, those statistical studies, they deemed inconclusive because they could not convincingly, at least not convincingly, convincing enough for themselves, identify a pattern of sickness. But the community of Tallevast, Focus, actually selected its own public health expert, Dr. Gasana, who conducted a health study with a team of researchers in 2012. And he identified a clear cancer cluster in Tallevast. What Dr. Gasana identified was a significant um, significant rate of cancers and miscarriages in Tallevast compared to other Black communities in the state of Florida. The state of Florida has the Florida Department of Health, the Northern Florida Department of Environmental Protection have acted on that information. In fact, they haven't followed up since they conducted their own health studies in 2007 and 2008. So there remains this high rate of cancer in the community. Some residents who have transitioned at this point, some residents who have moved away, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been impacted by this very dangerous chemical that many had been consuming throughout their lives.
Mhm. I understand that they eventually filed suits and won some sort of relief. I noticed the article didn't say exactly what it was. That's not important. Uh, what's the status of that town now? Uh, because I understand all the water table is going to be polluted probably for the next 100 years or so. What happened to the town? What's happening right now, and what's being done about correcting this?
Yes. So, as part of the agreement between Lockheed Martin, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and the community of Tallevast, uh, Lockheed Martin was essentially granted 5 years. They were given 5 years to try and clean up the contamination in the groundwater. So Lockheed Martin installed a state-of-the-art water treatment plant right in Tallevast. In fact, on the land where American Beryllium Company used to stand. And so this treatment facility has been in operations now for almost 7 years. It actually may be in the seventh year. So it's almost 2 years past the 5 year checkpoint. Uh, the agreement was that within those 5 years, Lockheed, along with its consultants, was supposed to sit down with Tallevast residents and Tallevast legal representation to determine how successful the remediation has been. To my knowledge, that meeting hasn't happened, and now it's 2 years past the original agreed upon 5 year checkpoint. So, what I can say about that is our own scientists at Williams College. We have been working with the community. Our geosciences department has been working with the community to monitor what has happened and what the state of the Tallevast environment is. And by environment, I mean its soil, its water, and its air. Because what we don't know is how that remediation process has impacted the soil. Just by anecdotal evidence from community members and even from our own sort of preliminary measurements, there are a number of soil indentations, soil really on the verge of sinkholes, or sinkholes in the community that can likely be tied to the remediation process. Because what happens during the remediation is that the groundwater is sucked up through the soil, channeled to the treatment facility. It's run through a cleaning process and then channeled back into the community soil. And so that process, given how aggressive that it's been leaving soil impressions throughout the community and leaving homes vulnerable to, rather, leaving the foundations of homes vulnerable to collapse. And we also don't know how the remediation process has affected or has potentially led to the degassing of TCE into the air that residents are breathing. These are all reasonable geoscience questions that should be asked and should be posed. To my knowledge, Lockheed Martin has not come back to the table with the community to talk about the state of things. So that's where things stand now. And is the lawsuits that you mentioned. There have been a number of lawsuits. There was one, rather the largest lawsuit was Law Ward versus Lockheed Martin, I believe. And there was a settlement for an undisclosed amount that was divided amongst the residents of Tallevast who had been impacted. And there was essentially a formula that was created, a formula, I don't know what it was, but it determined how much money each resident, each homeowner would, or property owner would receive. So residents received different amounts and they had to sign non-disclosure agreements to get their settlement amount. And so it's created, at least at one time, it created, I think, quite a bit of tension in the community because they weren't legally supposed to talk to each other about what had happened. And the settlement, I think, signaled for many, and I suspect for Lockheed, that this would be the end of it, right? We give you this money, we'll treat your water, and that'll be it. But things are far from resolved. And as I mentioned in the discussion of in my account of the remediation process, there are still many aspects of the situation that remain um, uh, unaddressed, and that deserve to be dealt with.
Yes, all throughout this whole thing, from the two military men establishing the plant, uh, um, to all the way up to the end, to the use of the metals for the space shuttle, satellites, etc. Uh, Lockheed Martin. It all seems to tie directly into the military industrial complex. Talk a little bit about that and how that might even be partly responsible for the environmental racism that's taking place, because you did mention Africa, and I know there are places in South America that's been violated and polluted and so on. How does the military industrial complex play a role in this extraction and abuse of extraction of minerals, but abuse of uh, communities of color?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I think that at least in the case of Tallevast, the military industrial complex, in the form of production, in the form of the production of materials that are necessary uh, for for weapons, for satellites, and the like. Um, that's a dimension of the industrial complex that I don't know that gets the same kind of coverage, or rather, at least in the sort of public, or scholarly discourse, whether production is included in the same way as something like the like military occupation, uh, of there being actual military bases, and the impact of bases on environments. And we see that throughout the globe, in the Philippines and Guam, and in Hawaii. I mean, it's that's global as well. But what's happened in Tallevast, and um, and in many communities throughout the South. I mean, throughout the Southeast, and that's one of the aspects of this story that was particularly striking to me in doing this research, is the number of military production facilities that were present in the Southeast uh, throughout the 20th century. A lot of those have closed down, like the American Beryllium Company, but what they left behind, is still there. And so throughout the Southeast, at my last count, there were over 40 facilities associated with what is now known as Lockheed Martin, and that's just one company. Most recently, there was a lawsuit brought before Lockheed Martin. I think it was filed in January, in Tangelo Park, black community in Orlando, that suing Lockheed Martin for contaminating its groundwater, its water supply with TCE. Looks exactly like, or rather, very similar to the Tallevast case. Lockheed Martin has one of its major facilities in Orlando, and this community is now challenging Lockheed for contaminating its water. So to your question, I think that it's important to consider the military industrial complex, again, not only in terms of occupation, in terms of in terms of military bases, but then also what it takes to make the weapons that are used to war upon the rest of the world. In the public, it's known as, these things are important for defense, but it preys upon the process, preys upon uh, communities of color who are essentially left defenseless.
As you were talking, I was thinking about Vieques in Puerto Rico, where they used depleted uranium and apparently used Vieques, the whole island, as a test site, polluted the surrounding water, and so on. And in all of these, not all of these cases, but a number of these cases, the residents are living in these dangerous things, environments, and not understanding why their neighbor up the street is sick, or why uh, Mabel's granddaughter miscarriage. What can the community do to kind of like protect itself, or at least be aware that something's happening, uh, if there are industrial activities near their particular community? Is there anything that people can do to monitor this stuff?
That's an excellent question, and I think in in some communities, in some Black communities, the discussion of one's personal health condition uh, may be seen um, as inappropriate, or as a private affair, and I think it's very difficult, at least in some communities. It's very difficult to have, to discuss one's um, personal health condition with others, even in a tight knit community, that might be a hard thing to do. And it's even harder to think about the um, the collective physical health of a community in relationship to its surrounding industries. Um, just a brief anecdote. So one, as my wife and I teach a class every other year from Williams College, where we take students to Florida to look at cases like Tallevast throughout the state of Florida. As a part of the class, we spend time in Eatonville. Eatonville, Florida, was a home of Zora Neale Hurston, and so what's wonderful about spending time in Eatonville is that we can really expose students to that rich history of the community that was the setting for a number of Hurston's writings. Well, our last visit to Eatonville in 2019, I believe. Last visit to Eatonville in 2019, we went to we did a walking tour of Eatonville, and we went into the post office, into the community post office. So Eatonville is it reminds me a lot of Tallevast in the small, sort of close knit um, nature of the community, but then also that there are generations of families that have been, in the community. So we went to the post office, and we noticed, the students and I noticed, that there were these red hearts that had been cut from paper and that were taped throughout the throughout the post office, where the ceiling met the tops of the walls. And we asked our tour guide, what are those hearts for? What do they represent? And again, Eatonville is a small community. I don't know how many families or how many homes off the top of my head, but we counted about 50 or so of these hearts. And the guide told us, oh, that is to recognize the cancer survivors in Eatonville. That there's an annual acknowledgement, or an annual commemoration of cancer survivors in the community, and those hearts represent those survivors. But the guide did not connect what seemed to me and what seemed to my students at the time, because we had been talking about these issues, did not connect the rate of cancers to the surrounding industry. And I can't identify off the top of my head what the industries are surrounding Eatonville, but there were a couple, at least in our sort of driving tour of the area. So there are times when Black communities may be aware that there are a number of rather high rates of cancer, or a number of cancer survivors, but it may not be thought about in relationship to what is potential pollutants or polluters that are surrounding them. And so I would say that consistent and constant, just sort of health studies, health assessments, which community organizations can commission if they're near universities or colleges. They can hire public health professors, or even if there's a small public health unit, academic unit, at a nearby institution, they can collaborate with faculty in getting faculty to organize a class, to actually have a class where the faculty member trains students to actually do like a health study, going door to door, collecting information, and entering it into a database that can be updated periodically, just to get a sense of what rates of sicknesses are. Because as going back to, just to circle back to our original discussion about um, environmental racism, it's global, and more likely than not, if you're black, you are living near a polluting facility. So it's paramount to be in the world and to be in our homes, recognizing that fact that more often than not, we're living near something that can potentially harm us.
Okay, thank you, Brother James, Professor. That was very informative. Um, and so thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Conway. It's been an
Yes.
honor and a pleasure.
Okay. And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.